It was the late autumn of 1988 in the rural valley town of Oakhaven. It was that specific time of year when the air grew brittle, the leaves turned the color of rusted iron, and the ground began to harden in preparation for the deep winter freeze. If you stood on the main county road and looked down into the lush, fertile basin of the valley, you would see progress in all its loud, shiny, unapologetic glory. A wealthy property developer from the city, a man named Harrison Vance, had just purchased 2,000 acres of the richest riverfront land the county had to offer. He brought with him a fleet of gleaming yellow earth movers, a legion of engineers in crisp white hard hats, and a grand multi-million-dollar vision to turn the valley floor into an exclusive luxury estate. From dawn until dusk, the valley echoed with the high-pitched whine of modern hydraulics, the beeping of heavy machinery, and the confident shouts of men who believed they could tame the earth simply because they had enough money. But if you turned your back on the valley and looked up high onto the eastern ridge overlooking the town, you would see a very different kind of progress. Elias Thorne was a man who looked like he had been carved out of the very rock he spent his days moving. He was a man of few words, with hands stained by permanent black grease and eyes that always seemed to be looking at a horizon nobody else could see. He owned a massive, jagged, completely barren stretch of hillside. It was a dead zone where not even stubborn prairie grass would grow. Yet every single day from before the sun came up until long past dusk, Elias rode atop an old, heavily rusted 1954 Caterpillar D8 bulldozer. He spent his days grinding its heavy steel tracks against the stone-moving mountains of seemingly useless rock from one side of the barren dirt to the other. Vance was the shiny future. Elias was a stubborn relic, wasting expensive diesel on a graveyard of stone. And Harrison Vance was not the kind of man to let a contrast go unnoticed. The humiliation happened on a bitter Tuesday morning at Diner 42, the local spot where the town gathered for black coffee and cheap eggs. Elias was sitting in his usual corner booth, quietly looking out the frost-covered window. The bell above the door chimed violently, and in walked Vance. He was wearing a tailored wool suit that cost more than Elias's entire tractor, his expensive leather shoes, clicking sharply against the cheap linoleum floor. Flanked by 3 of his lead engineers, holding rolled-up blueprints like hunting trophies, Vance spotted the old man. The busy diner fell completely quiet. Vance smiled a sharp, predatory smile, walked over and leaned his hands perfectly flat on Elias's table. He did not lower his voice. "Are you trying to grow gravel up there, old man?" Vance asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "Because I have engineers with PhDs who can run soil tests for you, and I can save you the suspense. You are spending your life savings farming a parking lot." A few scattered, nervous laughs broke out across the diner. Vance chuckled, fueled by the audience, and patted Elias heavily on the shoulder. He offered to buy the rocky hillside right then and there for pennies on the dollar, just so he could use it as a dumping ground for the leftover concrete from the real construction happening down in the valley. The local men watched closely, holding their breath, expecting Elias to throw a punch. But Elias did not raise his voice. He did not clench his fists. He simply finished the last sip of his coffee, wiped his mouth slowly with a paper napkin, placed a crisp $2 bill perfectly flat on the table, and walked out into the freezing morning air. He could hear them laughing loudly as the heavy diner door swung shut behind him. The sound of their mockery carried on the bitter wind. But there was something nobody in that room knew. What Harrison Vance and his experts would find out later would change everything they thought they knew about the old man on the hill. Elias's silence in that diner was not surrender. It was the heavy, burdened silence of a man who knew a terrible truth and who was simply too busy preparing for it to care about the laughter of fools. To understand why Elias spent every waking hour digging into barren rock, you have to understand the history of the Thorne family. The town looked at them as uneducated dirt farmers who stubbornly refused to move into the modern age. But the Thornes were careful observers of the earth. Up in the dusty, forgotten attic of Elias's farmhouse, locked inside an iron-banded wooden chest, sat a fragile, leather-bound journal dating back to 1927. Written by Elias's grandfather, it meticulously chronicled the year of the Great Deluge. A freak atmospheric river had stalled over Oakhaven, dropping an impossible amount of rain. The river broke its banks and completely drowned the original town settlement, trapping hundreds in the very basin that Harrison Vance was now trying to pave over. The survivors rebuilt higher up on the foothills, but over the decades, the terrifying memories faded. Arrogance crept back in, leading men like Vance to look at the flat valley floor and see only dollar signs, entirely ignorant that he was building a luxury estate at the absolute bottom of a natural drain. Elias knew a 100-year flood was not a ghost story. It was a mathematical certainty, and the bill was coming due. But this story was not really about the weather. I need to stop here and tell you what Elias was actually doing up on that barren, rocky hill, because it changes everything. He was not trying to plant crops. He was not digging a useless hole. For 5 long, grueling years, under the guise of an eccentric old fool, moving rocks, Elias had been painstakingly carving out a massive catchment basin. The hillside was a natural blind canyon, and Elias was secretly emptying it. His old 1954 Caterpillar was not plowing a field. It was meticulously building a colossal dry reservoir, an emergency spillway hidden safely behind a thick natural retaining wall of solid bedrock. He was preparing to catch the ocean that was about to fall from the sky. As November rolled across the valley, the atmosphere in Oakhaven shifted. The sky bruised a deep, unnatural purple, and the autumn chill gave way to a relentless, biting rain. Down in the valley floor, Harrison Vance was not the least bit worried. He threw lavish catered parties in heated canvas tents for his wealthy investors, raising glasses of expensive champagne to toast his modern concrete levees and highly advanced computerized drainage pumps. He genuinely believed that his money and his engineers had completely conquered nature. But up on the eastern ridge, Elias Thorne did the exact opposite. He worked even longer hours, pushing his body and his old tractor late into the freezing, rain-soaked nights. The downpour turned his rocky hill into a slick, treacherous mess of mud and stone. But the old man did not stop. The townspeople would look up from the comfort of their warm, dry living rooms, see the lonely, dim halogen lights of his bulldozer cutting through the dark storms, and shake their heads. The whispers grew louder and meaner. They said Elias had finally lost his mind completely, fighting a pointless war against mud and stone. But Elias just kept digging. I need to pause here and tell you the real secret about that old 1954 Caterpillar tractor, because this story is not just about the man. It is about the machine. People constantly laughed at its rusted body panels, its deafening engine, and its leaking oil. They eagerly compared it to Vance's $1 million climate-controlled excavators that could be driven with the delicate touch of a computer joystick. But Elias's D8 was not a standard farm tractor. It was a highly specialized military logging variant, originally built for the deep frozen mud of the Pacific Northwest. Welded directly to the rear chassis was a massive power takeoff winch, spooling 200 feet of thick braided steel cable. It did not have delicate hydraulic sensors, computer modules, or electronic safety switches. It was pure, brute mechanical torque, driven straight from the massive diesel transmission. It was a beast explicitly designed to drag 1,000-ton redwood trunks out of impossible swamps. Elias knew a profound truth about engineering. He knew that when the water rose and the world went dark, fragile electronics would fail to protect themselves, but cold, forged steel would not. By the third week of November, the 100-year storm finally hit. It did not just rain. The sky opened up and tried to drown the earth. For 3 days and 3 nights, it was a violent, unrelenting torrent. The local river swelled from a calm blue ribbon into a raging, churning monster of brown mud and debris tearing violently at the riverbanks. Down in the valley floor, Vance's arrogance began to crack literally. The immense hydraulic pressure of the roaring river fractured his newly poured concrete levees. Then, the absolute worst-case scenario happened. The town's main electrical grid blew out in a massive shower of blue sparks. The valley went pitch black, and Vance's expensive electric drainage pumps died instantly. Absolute panic set in. Vance, covered in freezing mud, screamed at his engineers through the storm to fire up the modern excavators to build emergency dirt walls. They scrambled into the cabs and turned the keys. But the valley floor was already liquid soup. The heavy machine sank instantly into the deep mud. When the floodwaters touched the battery compartments, the highly advanced onboard computers detected the moisture and triggered the electronic safety systems. The engines shut down completely to protect their delicate hardware. The operators desperately tried to restart them, but the screens remained dead. Millions of dollars of state-of-the-art engineering sat paralyzed in the mud, entirely useless. By midnight, the town's sirens were wailing. The police ordered a mandatory evacuation, but the access roads were already washing out. Hundreds of townspeople gathered on the high ground near the diner, shivering in the dark, watching the black water rise to swallow Vance's empire, knowing with absolute dread that their homes were next. Vance himself was standing near the edge of the rising black water, covered head to toe in freezing mud. He was screaming frantically into a radio that had no signal, watching his arrogance, his wealth, and his legacy be swallowed whole by the earth, entirely powerless to stop it. And then, cutting through the wail of the sirens and the roar of the river, came a different sound. It started as a low, rhythmic thumping. It was so deep and heavy that the terrified townspeople standing on the hill felt it vibrating in the soles of their wet boots before they could clearly hear it over the howling wind. It was a mechanical heartbeat. Out of the pitch-black darkness, high up on the barren eastern ridge, a single pair of dim yellow halogen lights pierced the sheets of rain. It was Elias Thorne. He was driving the old 1954 Caterpillar straight down the treacherous, muddy incline. The heavy steel tracks slipped and slid in the sludge, but the sheer, unforgiving weight of the iron kept the machine grounded. He was heading straight toward the massive natural bedrock wall that separated his excavated dry basin from the flooded valley gorge below. What happened next was the part nobody in Oakhaven ever forgot, the story that would be told with quiet reverence for generations. The crowd on the hill watched in stunned, breathless silence. They thought the old man was coming down to push dirt to try and build a futile, desperate dam against the raging river. But Elias did not drive down to build a dam. He drove down to break one. When he reached the edge of the roaring floodwaters, he spun the massive tractor around, backing the heavy rear winch toward a critical load-bearing pillar of solid rock he had carefully preserved during his 5 years of digging. It was the keystone holding the entire natural retaining wall together. Elias threw open the steel door of his cab and climbed out into the driving rain. The wind tried to tear him off the machine, but he waded into the knee-deep mud, grabbed the heavy forged iron hook of the winch cable, and dragged it through the sludge. He wrapped the thick steel cable twice around the massive rock pillar, locking the hook securely onto the line. Down below, Harrison, Vance realized what the old man was about to do. Panic completely overtook him. He ran wildly up the muddy slope, waving his arms frantically in the headlights of the tractor. He screamed at the top of his lungs that Elias was insane, that he would kill them all, that pulling that rock would collapse the entire ridge and bury them in a mudslide. Elias did not even look at him. He climbed back into the open cab, wiped the freezing rain from his eyes, and reached down. He engaged the main transmission. He locked both tracks to keep the machine completely stationary. And then, with a hard pull, he threw the heavy steel lever to engage the direct drive power winch. The old diesel engine roared. A thick plume of black smoke shot violently from the exhaust stack, battling the rain. The braided steel cable ripped out of the mud and pulled completely taut, snapping the rainwater off it like a giant bowstring. The tension was unimaginable. For a terrible, agonizing second, the heavy steel tracks of the bulldozer slipped backward in the mud, dragged toward the gorge by the immovable rock. But Elias remained dead calm. He dropped his right hand and slammed the lever for the front blade. The massive steel plow crashed down, burying itself deep into the earth, acting as an immovable anchor. The engine lugged down. The RPMs dropped dangerously low. It sounded like the machine was dying. Any modern tractor would have immediately shut off its transmission to prevent the gears from shattering. But the old D8 did not have a computer to tell it to quit. It only had purely mechanical gears and the iron will of the man operating it. The engine emitted a deep guttural growl of mid-century American steel, refusing to surrender. The tractor dug in harder. The steel cable groaned, vibrating so fast it hummed over the sound of the storm. And then the ground shook. With a sound like a bomb detonating, the massive bedrock pillar shattered. The structural integrity of the natural dam instantly gave way. Thousands of tons of earthstone and mud collapsed inward, opening a massive gaping trench in the side of the hill. Instantly, the terrifying wall of floodwater that was seconds away from cresting and destroying the town found a new path of least resistance. The raging river violently changed course. It roared through the newly opened breach, surging directly into the barren rocky land that Elias had spent years hollowing out. For hours, the townspeople stood in the freezing rain, watching in absolute awe as the massive dry basin swallowed millions upon millions of gallons of violent water. It drank the flood. Slowly, miraculously, the floodwaters in the valley stopped rising. They held at the very edge of the ruined levees, and then, inch by inch, they began to recede. The town was saved. The morning sun rose slowly over Oakhaven, casting a pale golden light over a landscape that had been completely transformed. The sky was clear and blue, the wind was dead, and the air was eerily quiet. The townspeople gathered again on the ridge, looking down at the aftermath. Down in the valley floor, Harrison Vance's luxury development was a ruined, mud-caked graveyard. His beautiful paved roads were washed away. His $1 million excavators were buried up to their windows in thick brown sludge, ruined forever by the very water they were too smart to operate in. But when the crowd turned their heads and looked over to the eastern ridge, to the land they had mocked and laughed at for years, they collectively gasped. Elias Thorne's barren, ugly, useless stretch of rock was gone. In its place was a vast, stunningly calm, deep blue lake, shimmering beautifully in the morning light. It was holding the devastating floodwaters safely away from their homes, perfectly contained within the stone walls he had built with his own 2 hands. Elias was sitting on the tracks of his muddy, oil-stained bulldozer, quietly drinking hot coffee from a dented metal thermos. He looked exactly the same as he had the day he was laughed out of the diner. Harrison Vance, shivering and exhausted, slowly walked up the hill. His expensive tailored suit was destroyed, coated in drying mud. His arrogance was entirely washed away. He stood before Elias, a broken, humbled man who had just realized that all his wealth, all his degrees, and all his experts could not save him when nature came to collect its dues. Vance opened his mouth to speak. Perhaps he was going to apologize. Perhaps he was going to ask how Elias knew. Perhaps he was just going to say thank you. But Elias did not need to hear it. He offered Vance a very small, quiet nod. He screwed the cup back onto his thermos, stood up, grabbed a grease gun from the toolbox, and started carefully lubricating the winch cable. He did not say a single word. He did not need to. The profound silence of the entire town looking at him with newfound reverence was loud enough. There is a profound truth hidden in the dirt of old farms and the thick grease of old machines. We live in a world that constantly rushes toward the new, a world that equates wealth with wisdom and age with uselessness. We are so quick to laugh at the man who works in silence so fast, to judge the barrenness of a field, without ever taking the time to ask what is truly being built beneath the surface. But true strength does not boast. It does not need to shout in diners or wave blueprints to prove its worth. It prepares. It weathers the ridicule, the whispers, and the passing seasons, knowing that the real storms of life do not care about your bank account, your expensive suits, or how loudly you can speak. When the floodwaters rise, and they always do, it is not the loudest man who saves the day. It is the one who knew the rain was coming, the one who trusted the quiet wisdom of the past, and who patiently, relentlessly built a sanctuary out of the very stones the world threw at him.